After the brilliant victories in Italy, political games moved Suvorov to the mountains of Switzerland. Here he leads a campaign which, as Clausewitz put it, has no equal in all military history, and by its difficulty and endurance shown in it, bordering with almost unbelievable. A campaign that destroyed Russia's relations with its allies and allowed Russian soldiers and Suvorov to enter historical immortality. By the end of the summer of 1799, relations between Russia and its allies, especially Austria, were very strained. Paul, as a kind of knight, considered the war with France ideologically important, but gradually he realized that the Allies were using the Russians as cannon fodder to achieve their selfish goals. Austria had conquered Italy. England wanted to get rid of its longtime rival, the Holland's navy. The English wanted to seize those ships or destroy them. Under the guise of fighting the revolution, England persuaded Paul to take part in a joint Holland expedition. That worried the Austrians, since they had ruled the area before France took it away. In addition, neither England nor Austria wanted to strengthen Russian influence in Italy, so they wanted to withdraw Suvorov's army from there. Using the French siege of Philipsburg as an excuse, the Hofkriegsrat ordered Archduke Charles to immediately withdraw all his troops from Switzerland. The positions held by his 60,000-strong army were supposed to be held by Korsakov's Russian army, which arrived in mid-August and numbered only 27,000 men. They were facing, according to various estimates, from 60 to 70,000 troops under the command of one of the best generals of France, Massena. Realizing the dangerous situation in which he puts the Russians, Archduke Charles, on his own initiative, left in Switzerland 22,000 Austrians under the command of Hotze, which were to stand until the arrival of Suvorov. The Field Marshal received orders for a general movement of troops at the end of August. At the same time, the Archduke began to withdraw his troops. Suvorov was surprised by the actions of the Austrians. Archduke Charles, throughout his standing in Switzerland, having a numerical advantage, not only failed to smash the French, but now put the Russians in a very dangerous position. Charles's indecisive actions some assessed as cowardice. Thus, Suvorov began to prepare for the upcoming campaign. He was forced to delay a little due to the French advance to lift the siege of Tortona. Moreau quickly retreated as soon as he learned of the Field Marshal's return. The garrison of Tortona surrendered on September 11th. On the same day, the Russian troops marched northward. Arriving at Taverno, Suvorov again discovered the incompetence of the Austrians. They were supposed to provide the Russians 1,400 mules for supplies transportation. However, nothing was ready. After a few days, only 650 mules were delivered. Suvorov ordered the use Cossacks' horses for this purpose, and the Cossacks themselves were to act as light infantry. Suvorov's main goal is to link up with the troops of Korsakov and Hotze. Korsakov located his main forces at Zurich, having advanced posts at the river Limmat. Hotze's troops were divided into three groups. One, under Hotze's personal command, stood between Lake Zurich and Lake Wallenstedt. Jelicich's troops were between the towns of Wallenstedt and Sargans. The third group, commanded by Lincoln, was moved towards Elanz and was closest to Suvorov. Lecourbe's division formed the right flank of Massena's army. Gudin's brigade occupied the Saint-Gotthard Pass. Lecourbe himself, with the men of Loison, occupied Altdorf. Molitor's brigade guarded the crossings of the river Linta between Neffels and Glarus. In front of Hotze stood Solt. Massena concentrated his main forces against the Korsakov's troops. The Allied plan was as follows. Suvorov goes through Airolo, St-Gotthard Pass, Amsteg to Altdorf. Here he marches by road to Schwyz. Austrian troops attack the enemy. The Austrians cross the river Linta, smash Molitor, and go to join Suvorov to Schwyz. Thus, there would be an opportunity to reach the rear of Massena's army. Troops Korsakov had to support the general offensive and cross the Limmat. Austrian headquarters also considered the option of moving Suvorov's army to the northeast through Elanz, Kur. But this way required more time, which the Allies didn't have. Suvorov was eager to connect as quickly as possible with the rest of the forces. However, the Austrian headquarters made one important mistake, which will be discussed further. Meanwhile, Massena, taking advantage of Archduke Charles's withdrawal from Switzerland, planned to strike Korsakov and Hotze. It is important to understand that neither Suvorov nor Massena knew anything about each other's plans. Intelligence was too bad. Only before the beginning of his offensive on Zurich-Massena began to receive vague news about the Russian troops at Saint-Gotthard. On September 21st, Suvorov began to move north. At Biasco, the army divided into two parts. Suvorov knew that the French position on the pass of Saint-Gotthard is strong. Therefore, he prepared two strikes on it. Two-thirds of the army under the command of Derfelden go through Airolo and storm Saint-Gotthard from the front. This column was also supported by Strauch's Austrian brigade. A third of the force under the command of Rosenberg took a longer route, outflanking the French, through Descentes to the Urzern Valley. The Russians met the harsh conditions of mountain warfare without any experience. Rosenberg's movement in particular was uneasy. For several days, heavy rains worried the army. Rain, slippery roads, and steep descents and ascents slowed Rosenberg's column. On September 23rd, these forces reached Descentes. Here they were met by the Austrian brigade of Auffenberg, which was sent by Lincoln to reinforce Suvorov. Auffenberg was sent to Amsteg to cut off the French retreat. On September 24th in the afternoon, the main Russian column reached the French position at Airolo. A narrow path rose from this village, crossed the rivers several times, descending to them, and then rising again. To shackle the enemy forces and give time to Rosenberg's forces to appear at Urzern, Suvorov ordered to launch an attack from the front by three columns. The right column of Rosenberg and Schweikovsky had to outflank the French left flank using extremely difficult mountain path. The other two columns were to move directly through the Saint-Gotthard Pass. At 2 p.m., Bagration's troops attacked the French forward posts at Airolo, which after weak resistance began to retreat. The right column engaged in a hot battle at the foot of the mountains. Such enemy resistance did not stop the movement of the Russians, and Bagration began to climb the mountains. Meanwhile, the French were attacked at the Sorachia River and continued their slow retreat. The French defended stubbornly. They, hidden behind the rocks and ravines, by skillful fire inflicted heavy losses on the Russians. The enemy defended every step. Gudin received reinforcements from Lecourbe and took up a strong position ahead of Gospis. The Russian troops bravely launched an attack, but were repulsed with heavy losses. But the presence of Grand Duke Constantine and Suvorov himself encouraged the troops, who continued the fight. Bagration's column, meanwhile, was climbing from rock to rock with great effort. The Allied army was exhausted. At 4 p.m., Suvorov began the third general attack against the enemy's position. Finally, Bagration appeared on top of the mountains at the French left flank. The enemy did not expect the appearance of the Russians from this direction and was extremely surprised. Gudin began a hasty retreat to the village of Hospital. This crossing, says Clausewitz, causes the greatest astonishment, and it is the most amazing of feats during the whole Suvorov's campaign. The Russians finally took Saint-Gothard. Suvorov gave the troops time to rest and then began to descend the mountain. In the meantime, Lecourbe arrived at the hospital with the main forces. But then the French commander received information about the approach of Rosenberg's column. On the road from Descentes to Urzern, Rosenberg met two French battalions. The French were used to warfare in Switzerland and perfectly used the terrain. They resisted stubbornly against Rosenberg, but were eventually driven back. That column approached the descent to the village of Urzern. Rosenberg was cautious, looking from the heights of our days apparently unnecessary, and did not attack the enemy immediately. Rosenberg's Russian troops began to descend towards Urzern later in the evening. A thick fog was hiding the French troops. The Russians quickly descended to the plain, gave a rifle volley, and rushed into a bayonet attack. The French, who had not expected an attack, met the Russians bravely, but were crushed. Fog and night darkness saved the retreating enemy from pursuit. Rosenberg stayed at Urzern, where he found a large amount of food and ammunition. Meanwhile, Suvorov's troops with a fight occupied Hospital. Lecourbe, realizing that the path of retreat through Urzern was lost, ordered a general retreat to the west. Suvorov won his first victory in the brutal mountain war, but it was achieved with a heavy price. The Russians lost over 1,400 men. French losses are difficult to determine, but they were obviously much less. Faced with a war in the Alps, the Russians apparently experienced something like a thrill. The plains of Italy were left behind them. Narrow road through a narrow valley, rocky walls of the mountains, the endless climb uphill made an unpleasant impression. However, Suvorov's voice encouraged the troops during all the difficulties. North of Urzern, The road on the right bank of the river is blocked by huge rocks. A narrow hole called the Urzern hole, or Urnerloch, was pierced through this natural barrier. The passage was 80 steps long and a few steps wide. This road leaves the hole, circles the mountain, and descends to the famous Devil's Bridge. 20 meters below the bridge flows the Resa River with turbulent waterfalls. The position was very strong. On the morning of September 25th, Suvorov's army moved towards the enemy. The first attempt to pass through the hole ended in failure. The Russians were met with accurate fire. Then some forces were sent to move to the left bank and outflank the French. The soldiers bravely overcame the steep descent, crossed the turbulent stream of the river, and climbed up on the bank. This appearance scared the French, and they destroyed one arch of the bridge. But the Russians found a way out. They dismantled the nearby house for travelers and tied the boards with scarves. It turned out to be a perfect temporary crossing. The French were forced into a hasty retreat. Meanwhile, to the north, Auffenberg's Austrian brigade came to Amsteg and quickly occupied the town. But then Lecourbe's main force came up and just as quickly knocked the Austrians out of Amsteg. The French continued their retreat to Altdorf. Suvorov pursued them. On September 26th, the Russians engaged in a skirmish with Lecourbe's advanced posts in front of Altdorf. But the French commander did not dare to test his fate and quickly crossed to the left bank of the Risa. In the town, the Russians found some supplies of food and ammunition, so needed for the army. Arriving in Altdorf, Suvorov saw with his own eyes the terrible mistake in which his Austrian headquarters involved him. The road from here to Schwyz did not exist. Men got to Schwyz back then only by water, but the French seized all the boats. How could such an important detail have been overlooked? No wonder that the future compiler of the Allied plan at Austerlitz-Weirother took part in drawing up a plan for the movement of Suvorov's army. We must give Suvorov credit. He did not rely only on staff officers. He wrote to Austrian generals, Hotze, Jellachich, Lincoln, who were familiar with the terrain, with a request to report on the possible difficulties of the path. And none of them informed the Field Marshal about the non-existent road from Altdorf to Schwyz. Betrayal is unlikely. It is not favorable to the Austrians, but then it's just staggering incompetence. At Altdorf, the army was in a poor condition. They were exhausted from the extraordinary crossings and were on the verge of starvation. All the food they had carried with them was almost gone, and supply wagons could not catch up with the army and stretch from Airolo to Altdorf. Suvorov was deeply worried about the fate of Korsakov and Hotze, who would have been surely defeated if he had retreated. He did choose to do so. He decided to advance. But how? Here lay the path over the Kinzig Pass to the Muten Valley. It was only for the inhabitants, not for the army. But Suvorov chose this path. He had to go along such a footpath, on which perhaps no army has ever set foot since wars have been fought. The fact that Suvorov demanded this of his army in the exhausted state in which it arrived at Altdorf was testimony to the incredible strength of will of the commander, and that he got it from her was proof of Suvorov's remarkable power over the spirit of his troops. Without a day's rest, the army began to cross Kinzig on the morning of September 27th. Gradually, the path became steeper and narrower, and in some places it disappeared on the rocks. The troops had to climb one by one, then on bare rocks, then on slippery clay. In some places they had to climb on a kind of stairway where the soles of their feet could not even stand. In other places the stones crumbled because of a careless step. Then the soldiers had to get stuck in the loose snow that covered the top of the ridge. It was hard to climb such a mountain on foot. Horses and mules loaded with cannons and ammunition suffered much worse. The poor animals could hardly move their legs, often fell off the narrow path, flew down and crashed on the rocks. It happened that they dragged men with them. Each step cost a life. The path was 10 miles long. The army moved slowly, leaving a terrifying trail of dead men and animals along the way. The army's rearguard arrived at Muttental only on the evening of September 28th, and the wagons stretched for 2 more days. Bagration, descending into the valley, found a small French post in the village of Muttental. The Russians quickly knocked it out, and the enemy retreated to Schwyz. Some historians are surprised by the passiveness of the usually energetic Lecourbe. Why didn't he attack the Russian rearguard with all his forces? Suvorov once said, "Surprise the enemy, means victory. Lecourbe couldn't believe that Suvorov's army will go this way. In the end, the Russian rearguard repulsed only one weak attempt by the French to cross the river and then moved freely to the Mouton Valley. In the Mouton Valley, rumors began to reach Suvorov, which were soon confirmed that Massena had inflicted a heavy defeat on Korsakov at Zurich. To the east, Soult crossed the Linta and defeated Hatz's troops. Hatze himself died in the battle. Jelatich's column attempted to cross the Linta at Neffels, but was defeated and began to retreat. Lincoln's troops, who were advancing from the south, from Ilans, pushed the French back as far as Glarus. But after receiving news of defeats on other fronts, Lincoln also began to retreat. Massena received news of Suvorov's movement and began to concentrate his forces against him. The main French forces arrived at Schwyz. Molitor's troops were closing the passage to the east for the Russians. Go back through the Kinzig Pass was impossible. Lecourbe's forces were ready to fight. Suvorov was completely surrounded. The Russians were on the verge of disaster. How will Suvorov get out of this?